So we are discussing about identifying functions modules in a program, and we saw it provides abstraction, reusability, efficiency in code maintenance, and so on. There are many advantages. But one thing then we have to be very critical that these modules contain set of instructions that are manipulating the variables, and those variables need to be manipulated, need to be updated or changed by different modules. So how we will manage those variables so that they can be accessed by different modules, and depending upon this what they need to do, they can execute their functions, they can execute their instructions, update their variables depending on business logic, and entire program can run in normal fashion. So scope of variables is very critical over here. So have you heard of local variables and global variables, and what is the difference between them?
The global variable is able to be used throughout the whole program.
Yes.
Local variables only in, the set function, and it can't be accessed outside the function.
So when we define a function, variable within a function, then the scope of that variable is within the function. Okay. So in case of local variables, if we have defined a function and within that function we define a variable, that variable will be created as soon as that function is called, that instruction within that function is called, and as soon as that function finishes its execution, that variable will get destroyed. So the lifespan of that variable is till execution of that variable. Whereas global variables are the one they will not destroy unless we close the program. So their lifespan is still the execution of the overall program. Okay. And data dictionary is the one which we create initially, that will list down all possible variables that we need in our program or in our module. Okay. And once we have data dictionary, and using that dictionary we can codify the proper variable within the respective modules. So data dictionary is very critical in this regard. When you are doing analysis and design, when you are doing identifying your modules, you also have to create data dictionary in parallel. Okay. How you will basically pass these variables to certain modules, like interfaces we discussed before. These variables need to share information, and while sharing information we are talking about variables. I have one example about PHP, how we can define variables in PHP, global variables. So this is a simple code over here. If you see, I define one variable over here which is outside of the function $z, and I assign a value to that variable. Now in PHP this is a variable that has scope in entire execution of the program, so we can consider it as a global variable. Whereas this is a statement, sum statement we are trying to execute, and this sum statement basically sending these two parameters to these functions. This line is commented right now, and what it does basically, it adds up two numbers and returns z value to this function. And if I execute this one, I just refresh it, so you can see that it prints 15 over here, and when I print z, it's still printing the 155 which was assigned to this variable in start of the program. Okay. So this local variable which we have created with same name does not have any impact on this variable which is global in nature, and this is local in nature. Okay. But if I change this line over here, uncomment this line, now we are saying that this z global variable which we are going to use in this function should basically the global variable value should get updated. So if I refresh this program now, see, now within this function I am accessing the global variable, and how I am telling that I am accessing the global variable, using this global keyword next to the variable. And once this variables get updated, I am able to access the value of z, the updated value, outside of the program. So in PHP this is how we define global variables. Okay. In today's lab in ASP.NET using C# embedded code approach which we are doing on labs, I have mentioned in today's lab that in start of the program, after you define your page declarative, you can define your variables over there, functions over there under the script tag, and if you do that, then they will be accessible throughout your page. So this is how you can define your global variables. So once you are able to identify the scope of variables, then you can continue with your development. So this is pseudocode and pictorial representation of defining variables. Over here, the variables which we are defining, they are global in nature, okay, because they are outside of the methods, and these methods can access them depending upon language and how a language allows you to access those variables. If it is PHP, then you have to use global keyword along with that variable within that function, okay. So when we define modules, definitely we pass values to those modules in order to achieve certain functionality. And we discussed this case before that we have a payroll system in which we are trying to calculate a salary of a person, and depending upon certain condition we need to call an overtime module. An overtime module basically try to calculate the extra number of hours a person has worked and give him some extra pay rate, which is 1.5, and once that is computed, we can display the value, okay. So in this case, we are passing certain values to the function, trying to compute something, and we are getting something in return, which is overtime salary. So we sometimes we do pass values to parameters as a parameter to the module to compute something and get something in return. But there are certain cases where we don't need to pass any values, and one example is logout function. So if you want to destroy the session variable which we discussed in the first lecture, that the visitor card for each user, when basically server creates a unique ID for that person, using this logout function, you don't need to pass any variable, okay. Maybe sometimes you need to pass some default value to error module. There would be cases when you call error module, you don't pass any value from the program. If program does not pass any value, you want this function to take in default value. So this is default value if value does not come from the program, okay. And different programming languages have different syntax to achieve this functionality. So if program does not pass any value, this value 1 would be passed into the function, okay. And the function accordingly will do something. So we could have call the function by parameters, with parameters, without parameters. We can call them by reference or by value. By reference we saw by using the keyword global, and by value is a simple way in which whenever parameter is passed, it will be get copied to the variable that is defined in the declaration of that method, okay. Now once you have those methods, a number of methods increase, you can also depict them on your flow chart, and this is how you can represent them. So it just shows you hierarchy. It does not show you how they are being called, okay. So this is hierarchy of modules, and there are many ways you can represent a different aspect of information. One example is, for example, if module is being called or being used in more than once in a program, then you can represent by a shaded corner, okay. So that was regarding software instruction side, where we identified modules, we looked at the variables, how critical they are, especially the scope and so on. Now we are looking at the documentation. So whenever you develop a program, you have to give some documentation. Either you generate some documentation or you need to give some documentation, or both cases could be there. So who are basically a user who will consume this documentation? This could be a system user who are going to use the information, and this information could be a manual how to use the system, how to give the input, how to submit the information, how to read the information, what does it mean, and so on, okay. And this information could be for programmer as well, especially the flow charts you're creating. This is also a part of documentation, software documentation, and this will be input to the developer who is going to develop your program. So these two type of documentation are basically part of this software. Project documentation again can be divided into two sections, into two categories. One is internal program, which we refer to the comments. All the comments that you give into your program, they are called as internal documentation. Whereas external documentation is the documentation which you before as analysis and design. Okay, for example, if you're trying to build a software for a company and that company wants to generate certain report, you can use that report and do some documentation about it, okay, before going to your main logic. So that documentation is considered as external program documentation. So this is these are some best practices, you can say, for commenting the code. They should be short, sharp, and to the point. That they can serve the purpose. Okay. You don't need to repeat the code, especially when you're giving the comment. Some of us, we do have a habit that we repeat the code as well, but it's of no use. This is one way you can do the comments. This is another way you can start your comments, in which you basically tell about who are you, what lessons you give it to others, how they can modify it, and so on. Okay, so these are multiple line comments. Depending upon language, you have different constructs to basically start and end these comments. This is the documentation in which, as I mentioned to you, that as a part before analysis and design, you can look at the company reports, and they may want same report to be produced by your system. Okay, so this can be input to your system for analysis and design, and it would be output of your system as well as a report for that company. So you need to take those that sort of documentation into account as well. So initially it may be, if it's a new report, it may be created for the end user to understand it, that this is how report will look like. What do you think? Do you want to add some more information on this report, or it's okay? So this could be used for iterative understanding of the problem as well. These are a few other examples. For example, you can generate some documentation which can show that how the page will look like, and information A, B, C would be displayed on this. For further information, you have another page that can drill down to further details. So these sort of documentation you can use in both cases, especially when you're interacting with the client, building a business logic, as well as output of your system. What would be the, for example, graphical user interface of your system, and you can use as a part of documentation as well. Input documentation is very critical because it tells you, like data dictionary, it tells what sort of information you are capturing, what would the data types of the variables you are going to use. If you are developing a database, what would be the tables in there, what would be the columns of those tables, how much value you can save in those tables, okay, what would be the possible strings that can be allowed, especially date formats will be allowed in the database. So all this information, again, it will be stored in a data dictionary, and that dictionary is being used later on when you are doing further analysis and design of the database, or you are doing coding. And this information is very critical when you are designing your web form as well. As we all know, on web forms we have certain checks, we have certain constraints. The user should enter this number of characters as username or password. Okay, so these should be aligned with what you have in data dictionary. Okay. So this is again further information on, you should define what which fields can allow null values or not. Data types you need to define, maximum, minimum length, possible input values other than if they are not string, if they are taking one character, date formats, and so on. So why we are doing all this? Because we need to validate the input information, and validation can be done on the client side or on the server side. On client side validation, as we discussed in the first lecture, we have JavaScript. JavaScript can validate the information on the client side. Okay, when you click the submit button, JavaScript can run through your form and can identify whether the information you have entered is according to rules that have been specified for this web page or not. Okay, so this can be done in JavaScript, or it could be on server side, where you submit information on server side, and on server side you check all the values, whether it's null or not, and so on, and then you show the results. In your first assessment, you don't need to do client side validation. You will do server side validation, okay, for all the possible validation that you have been asked for. But there are certain cases, especially in web application, where, for example, in case of null values, we can do this on client side. But there are certain cases which cannot be done on client side, like authentication of the user. Authentication of the user, whether this is legitimate user or not, that can be done only on server side, because on server side you have a code that will connect to the database, will retrieve information, and then make a decision whether this is a legitimate user or not. So validation can be done on both sides, but there's some validation that can only be done on the server side. And this is just a pictorial representation that whatever you define on the form, the constraints you define on the form, they need to be matched with the database. If they don't match with the database, then again your application can run into problem. For example, if you have specified 15 characters for the name, and your database basically, when you design a table, you set only 10 characters, 10 varchar, then the 5 characters of the name will get truncated, and the information that will be saved in the database will be only first 10 characters. Okay, so these two things should be synchronized. So in short, program documentation can contain all the things which we are discussing in this course: the flowchart, the pseudocode, data dictionaries you create, entity relationship diagrams you could create in order to better understand the program problem that you are defining. So these are technical documentations, and they are meant for technical people. Okay, whereas user documentation will be instruction manuals that can guide the user how to use the system. If this error happened, what you need to do it. If there is a patch available, these are the steps you need to take on in order to install that patch, and so on. And mostly it is a screenshot so that user can easily navigate to that information. Whereas this would be all technical information. So it's very important that user documentation should be written in a language that they can understand. And who is the best person to write those languages? Technical writers. It's not the programmer who has programmed the code should be writing this document. Which in reality most of the small to medium scale software houses, mostly programmers do this task. But this is not a good approach. Technical writer needs to understand the system, and then accordingly they have to develop the documentation. And it will basically outlines all possible information that user may encounter that can help the user in order to fulfill its job accurately. For example, how to prepare input information, especially if so your software needs to upload certain files, Excel files. What form should it allow CSV file or not? Should it allow 95 for Excel file or not? What sort of headers should be defined, and so on. So you have to outline that all the information so that user can better prepare information for your system. Okay, and navigation, what data is allowed, and so on. So in short, today we basically look further on building the structure into a program. We look at the modules, and when we define modules, abstraction is the one way to move forward. It helps us to better conceptualize, better visualize the software, and divide into some number of modules so that different people can work on those modules. It helps us to achieve various advantages like reusability, efficiency, better management, and so on. And while doing that, we have to be careful about the data which these softwares need to manipulate. What will be the scope of each variable? How they would be handled by each method? How methods would call each other in order to manipulate the data? So those things are very important. In order to understand all this together, you need some diagrams. So we saw that hierarchy diagrams of those modules give some idea about abstraction level. Okay, as you go further down, you're going to further details, further refined modules, and so on. And as we are focusing on the set of instructions, modules, data, we have to give equal importance to the documentation as well. The technical and non-technical documentation, which will become a part of software, and it will be used as long as software is in maintenance phase. That's it for today. Do you have any question? No? It was pretty simple. That's good. So in today's lab, again, the example which we discussed in the class about payroll system, you will be codifying that, okay? And start looking at regular expressions. If you have any issues with regular expressions, drop me an email or post it on the forum, and I will get back to you. Okay, thank you very much.